All right, everyone. Today we are going to be talking about gender roles of the 1950s. The gender roles of the 1950s are really important to talk about because, especially when you consider where we've just come from, World War II, where there was a lot of change and progress for different minority groups, both gender, racial, and ethnic, that we do see a little bit what seems like a turning back in time, like where it seems like we're taking a couple steps backward here towards progress. But because of seeing so much growth in World War II and then being forced movements against that as the norm in the 1950s, there's going to be a lot of culture clash as these new wave of Americans come to grow up during this time period, start to question their lives. And it's going to take place in the 60s and 70s when all this change is going to happen. And some of this change or this early change is going to come from the top down. It's going to come from our president, President Eisenhower or Ike. He was a Republican, but he called himself a modern Republican. His modern Republicanism was when it came to one side of his policies, it says, I'm conservative when it comes to money. So he's very fiscally responsible, but he was much more like the Democrats when it came to social policy. So he's liberal when it comes to people, conservative when it comes to money, and liberal when it comes to people. And that's going to allow for a lot of different changes, and he's going to um, create a world where in the United States, there's a lot of things going for the US at this time period, but is going to be doing very, very, very well. There's brand new technology for the first time. And it's not so much that it's new, but it's new to people. People have a larger access to, such as, right, the automobile. The automobile is new to people. People weren't able to afford them as readily. The last time was a little bit around the 1920s, but even there's a huge wealth gap. It becomes much more common for many people across the United States to have one or sometimes even two cars. Things like the television drastically changed the way that we get information, entertainment, and culture. Then there are other various consumer goods, whether it be the prevalence of having refrigerators and freezers in your home, or even something like a waffle iron, or different cleaning techniques or technologies for that. But overall, life in the 1950s was very prosperous. We may use the word affluent. Very, very good standard of living. People have a lot of extra income in their lives, and America has the highest standard of living of any country in world history in the 1950s. And that's not just saying the highest standard of living in the United States, the highest standard of living of any country in all of world history by the 1950s, coming from huge economic depression in the 1930s. But think about when people are born, those people that grew up in that era and then in the Great Depression, and then maybe served in World War II, are now seeing success and in the 1950s. But those children that those people are having are born into this. They never experienced the World War. They never experienced the Great Depression. So everything that they know of is all wrapped up into their modern world, which is going to be the 1950s. So eventually that's going to breed a lot of conflict between these two generations. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, we're going to talk about what life is like in the 1950s when we're talking about gender roles. What's acceptable for men? What's acceptable for women? What do we see in media versus what is it actually like? And we'll kind of debate that as we go through. So, um, again, things we can think about gender roles in the 1950s. What are they like? Right. So, understanding what are the roles for men and women that are expected in society. We can see that through media. We can see that through literature. We can see that through other forms of text. And also, right, how does it compare to changes in World War II? So, how is there that contrast? Think about why this is going to be so unsettling for so many during this time period. All right, let's start with women in media first. The ideal woman. In media, women are going to be portrayed as housewives and mothers in almost every single context. You can also notice kind of how they're expected to dress or portray themselves. But the way that we get this information is very similar to the way that we're getting this information, consuming these images today, because of more modern technologies like TVs. Movies are still around, but other forms of advertising boom in the 1950s. And the big push here is conformity. And there's a lot of different stereotypes for sure. And this may not be the bulk of Americans, but This is how women are portrayed in media. And think about how there may be unrealistic, right, portrayals in media today of women or men, right, or of different people of color. But just because that's the portrayal doesn't mean that's the reality as a whole. But that's what a lot of people are sort of basing their experiences off of. That's what they're trying to inspire to be or encouraging. You notice in these, all three women wearing aprons, all three women are dressed up, right? People don't wear high heels and dresses and makeup and have their hair all done up to be cooking all day. Um, and that's what all of them are doing. We can look at an advertisement for stockings, right? Women are expected to wear stockings as part of kind of how they're supposed to dress. That seemed appropriate. And this is an advertisement in a magazine, I believe, of Lux stockings. Now, there's a couple things you can take note of. Number one, we can look at the text. Married, no reason to neglect stockings. And then we see this text right below it, right here. Husbands admire wives who keep their stockings perfect. Like that is what's going to make him love you. One, ridiculous. Two, there's more text here that you can read and understand the way that they're advertising, pitching it, right? But the other thing we can do is images. How is this woman portrayed? She's dressed up. She's a housewife. She's knitting. That's all she's doing while the husband is reading. But look at his face. Look how disgusted he is by this woman's unsightly stockings. Constant runs are unsightly and expensive. Cut down with Lux. These are going to fix those problems, and that these are going to make your man happy. That's the reason why you're doing it, right? That's the reason why you're doing it. Not for you, right? For him. So this is just one example. Let's take a look at another, right? This one is for vitamins, right? Vitamins for pep for vitamins. Notice that producer down there, if you catch that, Kellogg's, the same people that make cereal today, that's the same family company. The other thing we can have is the depiction how men are depicted to view towards women, and vice versa. In this case, once again, she's holding a duster in her hand. She's wearing high heels, dresses, apron, whole nine yards. And the gentleman, assuming her husband, right, his thought bubble. So the harder a wife works, the cuter she looks. Right? This is going to really make your husband attracted to you, how well you can do these chores, if you will, around the house. And then even if you can read that little cartoon down below, it says, "Gosh, honey, you seem to thrive on cooking, cleaning, and dusting, and I'm all tuckered out by closing time. What's the answer? Vitamins, darling. I always get my vitamins. That's what I do." And this is an example of how essentially your husband will react based on how hard you work, right? Notice all these depictions, how they're dressed, how they're portrayed as they can't help themselves, that they're constantly have to have this man's opinion. Or even this one, Schlitz is a beer company. It says, "Don't worry, darling, you didn't burn the beer. That it's okay. Like you're a terrible cook, even though whatever you're supposed to be." Right, again, depiction, right? Apron, shirts, right? We can see jewelry, all that fun stuff. But the way that she's depicted, that she's deeming herself as a failure because she can't cook, right? But this whole idea that it's all right, at least you didn't burn the beer. The beer is going to make things okay. There's all of these subtle little ways. Some are more subtle than others. Some are not. One, I think, most subtle way is the way that all of these women are dressed and portrayed, about what's expected, what's considered normal in all of these. Number one, and number two, right? The jobs that they're doing, the text always has a little bit. There's the explicit words that are said, but then there's sometimes something called subtext. There's kind of that reading between the lines aspect here. I think the more that we look at these examples, the more that we can get deeper into the story about the expectation for women at this time. This is probably the best example of the expectations of women in society. This is from a very famous magazine that's printed all across the United States, Good Housekeeping. Um, Good Housekeeping has been around for quite some time, and it's still around today. but it's a monthly publication, and this was printed back in May of 1955, so the middle of the 1950s. And the title of this article, as you can see, is The Good Housewife's Guide, or The Good Wife's Guide. So I'm going to take some time to read these to you because they're a little bit small and they'll zoom up and they'll change. But again, think about these expectations. Think about what's perhaps the most shocking to you. Would this ever be in any sort of text today, or what would be the reaction to people if this was printed in publications today? The number one tip to being a good housewife: have dinner ready. Plan ahead, even the night before, to have a delicious meal ready on time for his return. This is a way of letting him know that you have been thinking about him and are concerned about his needs. Most men are hungry when they get home, and the prospect of a good meal is part of the warm welcome needed. 2. Prepare yourself. Take 15 minutes to rest so you'll be refreshed when he arrives. Touch up your makeup, put a ribbon in your hair, and be fresh looking. He has just been with a lot of work weary people. 3. Be a little gay and a little bit more interesting for him, meaning happy. His boring day may need a lift, and one of your duties is to provide it. Especially that last line, whoa. Like that's, again, that expectation of what women are supposed to be doing. But don't worry, there is not just 3 tips on this list. It's much more, and it gets much more, we'll just say, shocking or interesting as we go along. Clear away the clutter, right? Number 4, make one last trip through the main part of the house just before your husband arrives. Run a dishcloth over the tables. During the cooler months of the year, you should prepare yourself. You should prepare and light a fire for him to unwind by. Your husband will feel he has reached a haven of rest and order, and it will give you a lift too. After all, caring to his comfort will provide you with immense personal satisfaction. Again, these ideas about what a woman should be doing, notice all of these different housework things, these expectations that you're not out all day. Women would not be out all day. Men would be. And that again, that last line, catering to his comfort will provide you with immense personal satisfaction. The goal of women at this time, according to this one article. The next one, minimize all noise. At the time of his arrival, eliminate all noise of the washer, dryer, or vacuum. Encourage the children to be quiet. Right? These ideas that this is what you're doing, you're making all this noise, right? This is what you're doing all day. You're just cooking, cleaning, things like that. You need to make sure that you really get around to making sure that it's pleasant when he comes home. Next one, be happy to see him. After that, greet him with a warm smile and show sincerity in your desire to please him. Listen to him. You may have a dozen important things to tell him, but the moment of his arrival is not the time. Let him talk first. And remember, his topics of conversation are more important than yours. Ugh, that one's pretty bad. Like I said, it gets a little bit deeper, but these expectations of not only what you should be doing, but how important these things may be based on your genders is going to be very different. Next one, don't greet him with complaints and problems. Next one, don't complain if he's late for dinner or even if he stays out all night. Consider this as minor compared to what he might have gone through at work. These this inability for wives to question their husbands, the expectation that they should be more submissive housewife. Again, very very different than today. And these last ones are where it gets much more extreme or much more uh, enraging for most of you. Next one, make him comfortable. Have him lean back in a chair, lie him down in the bedroom. Have a cool or warm drink ready for him. Like you're going to take care of like a servant. Next one, arrange his pillows and offer to take off his shoes. Speak in a low, soothing, and pleasant voice. Don't ask him questions about his actions or question his judgment or integrity. Remember, he is the master of the house, and as such will exercise with his fairness and truthfulness. You have no right to question him. And then this last one, a good wife always knows her place, right? These things, this is printed in a giant magazine. This is not like somebody's private speech. This is not somebody's journal. This is a well read, this is a very popular monthly magazine throughout the entire country. This is not an isolated thing. So really understanding the gender roles, how strict the expectations of them are, and how extreme they may really be. So, the big takeaway we can look at when we're looking at women is that in media, women are basically exclusively they're either mothers or they're housekeepers. That's pretty much how they're described, and that's just about it. But when we're looking at the reality of it, when we're looking at statistics, about 40% of mothers actually did have jobs. The reason was all this new technology, these new, say, whether it be vacuums or refrigerators or different ways of preparing food. In previous decades, women stayed home. They had to make three scratch meals a day. You couldn't prepare or freeze anything and just pull it out and whip it together. You had to do every part of this meal from scratch, and that's a bulk of what they had to do all day. Now, with all these changes, women can go and they can go to work, and then they can come home and they can still prepare dinner. There's still that expectation. There's still a gender gap there of expectations and sexism for sure, but that is definitely a lot of options available. So that's not really represented in media. 20% of suburban women reported being dissatisfied, isolated, and bored. So it's not that people were content with this lifestyle. When we're content with this lifestyle, there was this yearning for more. And eventually that's going to develop into actual progress or more ability as technology increases or it becomes more socially acceptable for women to take these leadership roles, whatever they may be. And even though women were working, there is still kind of this gender divide in the type of careers that are deemed acceptable. Women then, and even still now, and even when you look in film today, when we're talking about representation media, even in 2020 now, nursing, teaching, clerical jobs, all of these things are the stereotypical representation when you see a TV show or a movie, right? There was a movie series, there's about two or three of them that came out in the early 2000s of a series called Meet the Parents or Meet the Fockers. And in this movie, the whole running joke was that this man was a nurse and that this was the big, oh, you're not a doctor? Why aren't you a doctor? The woman's work. He's working and delivering babies, and it was this huge. That was the whole premise of this one character inside those films. And really, when you think about now how much has changed of that expectation, there has been some change, but how large sweeping changes? Not that much. Now let's jump over to the men. So how are men depicted? They definitely are depicted in a different light, but there is this expectation that men are assumed to have to fill. The ideal man was the boss. He was the provider, the breadwinner, right? He's always going to be dressed up, just kind of like women are, but you're going to be dressed up in suits, shirts, ties. That's the expectation, normal. Feeling casual, maybe you'll throw on a sweater. But that is the expectation for men everywhere they go, even wearing the hats as well. Um, there's some really famous TV shows from the time period, and even the title really brings to light a lot. Father Knows Best is a very, very famous show from the 1950s. Just that the kind of implications that come around with that. A great way of seeing that represented in media, that difference between men and women in the 1950s, or rather the expectations for men and women of the 1950s, you can check out in these two quick clips from the TV show Leave It to Beaver from the 1950s. It's a sitcom, so there's a laugh track and everything. But basically, what happens in this bottom clip down here with the dad and the son, they're talking about the son asks, how come when we're outside you do all the cooking, Dad, and when we're inside, Mom does all the cooking? And kind of his answer of the expectations of men and why men are better at certain things and women are better at certain things. And up in the top, the kid comes in. Really, he's talking about there's an IQ test at school, and he's really nervous about how bad he's going to do. And his kind of opening comments about why life is so much easier for women than it is for men, and what their expectations are about really what do children understand of that basic simplistic message. That's a really good way of understanding those. So take a look at those two clips. I'll leave the links down below. So in those last two video clips, you really can get a sense of kind of that humor, and you have to really think about why things are funny and why that's going to land. And part of it is because if it's part of the kind of unexpected, or it's that silly kind of ignorant little kid asking the question, doesn't really know, doesn't mean it perhaps in that way, right? Only can base questions off what they see. But again, the way that women and men are discussed in very large, open, wide casted television series, it's one of the most famous American TV series probably of all time, especially back in the 1950s, and that I think is pretty telling what people are comfortable with seeing. Now, when we're talking about what people are comfortable with seeing versus what is the rules, if you will, what's normal versus what's portrayed in media, we can also look at types of behavior. So, number one, right, obeying authority, obedience is super, super important. So you're going to see that in a lot of different um, forms of media and text and representation. And that includes even in the home, as the man is the master of the house. And so, wives and children, you must obey your fathers. You don't really display your emotions out in the open heavily, right? You must control your emotions, be under control. You want to fit into the crowd. Conformity is the key word. Conformity, conformity, conformity. And when it comes to sexual activity and sexual expression, don't even think about it, right? These are the things that are kind of ingrained as the norms in society in the 1950s. However, when we look at statistics, we know that that isn't necessarily how people behave. That's maybe how they behaved when they're in front of maybe authoritative figures, but we know that sexual behavior in the 1950s really starts to change. Premarital sex is extremely common. Extramarital affairs, right? So cheating on your spouse are very, very frequent. And so all of these stereotypes we see in media, not all of them are correct. So we really have to try to sift through everything. Not everybody was pious and chaste. And really, when looking at this, part of this could be this sense of affluence, that people to feel like they have choice in every realm of their lives, or that, for example, the automobile provides a lot more independence, and then that independence means that they're out from, say, the watchful eye of a parent or authoritarian figure, and so that they can do things that maybe wouldn't be acceptable in front of them, but now they can do things a lot more in private. Think about the way that you have so much privacy in your conversations to an extent, on your phones and your text messages and those private messages or Snapchats between people. That's another way that you have this privacy. Now, kind of, what are you going to do with it? And people feel like they're not being watched, and they can kind of do or say more so whatever they want. We're going to see even films that are going to represent a little bit of this promiscuity, right? Even look at these movie titles: "Don't Bother to Knock," "How to Marry a Millionaire," or this one, Marilyn Monroe, this famous symbol, right, sex symbol, if you will, and all kind of those movies. And this one, The 7 Year Itch, kind of the sexual innuendos with all of these films. But really understanding that not all stereotypes are true, and so we have to sift through to try to find that info. But the biggest way that we can really transfer this information is through television. And I think television is a great way, even still today, of gauging what people are okay with seeing on a regular basis. Probably the most famous TV show, I would say, of all time in American history, I would say number one is probably I Love Lucy. And so, what I would encourage you to do is watch an episode or two of I Love Lucy. It's great. It's actually really funny, even still, whether you're watching the black and white versions, right, which may seem different to a lot of people if you haven't had any experience doing that, but they do have remastered colored versions. But get that real authentic feel about what people were watching. It really becomes the new way of getting information, advertising. It is part of Americana and culture. It captivates people the same way that the television does when it first, or the internet does when it first breaks onto the scene, or cell phones, smartphones do when they first break onto the scene in American culture in different decades. And there's going to be another some sort of technology that's going to come around. Maybe it's going to be self-driving cars in the near future. But all of these things will continually change and piece by piece add to kind of the new norm for American society. Everything that could be advertised or sent, whether it's television shows, news programs, or just commercials in general, all that stuff is really going to be able to be portrayed to individual Americans in their own home, whether it's good stuff, right, prosperity, things doing well, or bad things like violence. But it's really going to change the hearts and minds of a lot of people. For example, in the civil rights movement, when people see these violent actions against peaceful protesters, or they see the death tolls start to rack up in Vietnam in the 60s and the 70s. And so it's really going to help change public perception in the good, but also in the bad. So now I encourage you, the best tool to really get a good grasp on the gender roles and really what life is like in the 1950s, or the depictions of what life is like in the 1950s, is to watch an episode or both of these of I Love Lucy. Um, they are really, really funny, number one, so you can actually enjoy it. Number two, the other thing is there's a lot of bigger details to it. Lucille Ball, who plays Lucy right here, she is kind of like the executive producer, which was very, very cavalier unheard of. She had her hand in a lot of this business and this show and the production, which was cool, right? Woman taking a kind of a lead role. And then also you have Ricky Ricardo over here. I can't remember the real actor's name, but it's just funny about the expectations of Americans. This was considered controversial in one aspect. She was a white woman, and then he was Cuban, and so kind of a semi-interracial, interethnic couple. And then to make things even more, again, and there at this time considered controversial, and you can be the judge for yourself. Many of the producers were a little bit against this actor, or having Ricky being Cuban. And the reason why is they said it was just too hard to understand. His accent was too thick. And again, you'll make the judge of that yourself. But my favorite two episodes to watch, the one on the right called Job Switching, down here, I'll leave these links down below, is a really, really hilarious episode, probably the most famous episode of all time, and I think it's the best episode of all time, of I Love Lucy, where what happens is this couple, the Ricardos, they have some friends, and the husbands say that the wives are just spending way too much money, and it would be so much easier. They have their life so easy. They just sit at home all day. The men say we could do the housework all day, and the women could never do their job. So the wives go and they get a job at a candy factory, and it's just so funny, so hilarious how this whole thing turns out. But again, the expectations of what is men's work and women's work, that's part of it. The other really, really good one is an episode called Ricky Loses His Temper. The expectation about what's okay for men versus women, or how they're going to react towards each other. Ricky and Lucy make a bet that Ricky can go the whole day or can go longer without losing his temper than Lucy can without going out and buying a brand new hat. Like that, all women do are shop and spend money, and that men, right, are just the breadwinners, and they can they have a lot more free realm in that, and they're just angry, and a couple of these is a little sketchy, but in Ricky Loses His Temper, there's another really, really interesting thing when we're talking about representation on couples in media. They're going to actually show a clip of them in their bedroom, which is a little bit cavalier, but it's not so much what you would imagine, or maybe what the reality is. And that's what makes it so interesting. Now, we already talked about the representation of sex and promiscuity in media, but how are they going to show just couples together? Are they going to even hint at it, innuendos at it? I don't know. You'll have to watch and find out. But you would imagine that couples would sleep in the same bed, but are they going to show that on TV? And if they do, that'd be extremely cavalier. But if they don't, what would their bedroom then look like? You'll get to take a look at that in that episode. So if you got any questions, drop a comment down below. But other than that, let me know if you need anything. Take care.